Imagine a world where the church had the power to control almost every aspect of your life. A world where the slightest misstep could land you in front of a stern panel of elders, facing public humiliation, fines, or even excommunication. This was the reality for many people in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in regions where the Reformed churches, inspired by John Calvin, held sway. In the heart of this world, the consistory, a church court, was the enforcer of moral discipline. These courts were not just about punishing sin. They were about maintaining a strict code of behavior that defined what it meant to be a good Christian. But what if the very system meant to create a virtuous society was itself flawed? One of the primary concerns of the consistories was sex. Not just any kind of sex, but the kind that was considered illicit. Adultery, concubinage, and premarital sex were the most common offenses. Imagine being a young couple, in love, and finding yourselves summoned to the consistory because you were caught in a compromising position. The shame and fear of being ostracized by your community would be overwhelming. Prostitution was another major issue. In some towns, the church was relentless in its pursuit of prostitutes and their clients. But there were other sins that were rarely mentioned. Homosexuality, bestiality, incest, and even abortion were so serious that they were often referred directly to secular courts. It's as if the church was more comfortable letting the state handle these crimes, perhaps because they were too taboo or too difficult to manage internally. Beyond sexual sins, the consistories were also preoccupied with behaviors that were believed to lead to moral decay. Drinking, gambling, and dancing were all seen as gateways to sin. In some places like Amsterdam, the Kerkeraad, church council, regularly dealt with drunks who had to be carted home sleeping in the streets or causing disturbances while on night watch. In the French Midi, the focus was different. Here the church fought against families holding balls during carnival time, men dressing as women on Mardi Gras, and youth groups staging charivaris, noisy, disruptive processions. These practices were seen as threats to the moral fabric of society, even if they were just forms of festive culture. While the church had a lot to say about personal behavior, it was surprisingly silent on economic matters. John Calvin, the father of the Reformed tradition, had some progressive ideas about usury, lending money at interest. He believed that moderate interest rates were acceptable for commercial loans, but he was still against profiting from a neighbor's distress. However, this didn't translate into much action by the consistories. In Geneva, Amsterdam, and Emden, the church did pay attention to economic behavior. They investigated bankruptcies, censured those who didn't pay their rent, and even broke up a brotherhood of printers who were defending their work interests. But in most places, the church was more concerned with drinking and gambling than with economic fairness. One of the primary goals of the consistories was to build a loving fellowship around the communion table. This meant spending a lot of time reconciling quarrels. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, the church would try to mediate before you went to court. Sometimes these reconciliations worked, but often they didn't. In Bacharach, more than 1 out of 3 couples summoned for marital discord appeared before the consistory more than once. The church also dealt with marriage and divorce. While the Protestant Reformation allowed for divorce in cases of adultery, the consistories were very hesitant to grant them. They preferred to force couples back together, even in cases of violence. It wasn't until the 18th century that attitudes began to change, and divorce became more common. The church's view of gender roles was deeply hierarchical. Men were seen as the heads of the household, and women were expected to be submissive. But despite this, the consistories often treated women more fairly than other institutions of the time. Men were more likely to be blamed for disorderly households, and were summoned before the church more often. In some places like the Bernese countryside, the church was seen as an ally to women, helping to uphold responsible masculine behavior. The principle that rank should carry no privileges in church discipline was often more aspirational than real. Powerful figures like the Baron of Ganges could often avoid the full force of the church's discipline. When he was caught dancing, the consistory visited him at his home to censure him privately rather than summoning him like an ordinary person. This special treatment was not always well received, and the church was sometimes reprimanded for it. The church's disciplinary efforts were not isolated. They often worked in tandem with the state to enforce moral laws. In many places, the Reformation led to harsher civil laws against various sins. The church would appeal to the secular authorities to take action, and sometimes the state would handle the more serious crimes. But this partnership was not without its tensions. The church's efforts to discipline the powerful could provoke strong reactions, especially from monarchs who saw the church's authority as a threat to their own. King James VI I of Scotland famously declared that a Scottish presbytery agreeth as well with monarchy as God and the devil. This was a world where the church's reach extended into every corner of life, from the bedroom to the marketplace, from the tavern to the town square. The consistory was always watching. It was a world where the line between sin and virtue was sharply drawn, and the consequences of crossing that line could be severe. But it was also a world where the church's efforts to create a moral society were often complicated by the very human nature of those in charge. In this world, the struggle for virtue was a constant battle, and the consistory was at the forefront of that battle. The Reformation brought about significant changes in the laws and social norms of Europe, especially in regions where the Reformed Calvinist faith took hold. Before the Reformation, some areas like Switzerland and southern Germany were already strict about community purity, enforcing laws against adultery, blasphemy, and luxury. However, the Reformation intensified these efforts and spread them across the continent, affecting territories of all major Christian confessions: Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed. One of the most striking changes was the legal penalties for adultery. The Old Testament, particularly Leviticus, states that adultery should be punished by death. By the early 16th century, many parts of Europe were already cracking down on sexual misconduct, such as closing public brothels in Germany and France. In 1532, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, introduced the Carolina, a new law code that included the death penalty for adultery. This harsh penalty was adopted by both Catholic and Lutheran regions, but it was especially common in Reformed territories. Reformed territories like Basel, Scotland, Geneva, and the Palatinate all implemented the death penalty for adultery. In Geneva, for example, several people were executed for adultery in the early 1560s, even before the law was formally enacted. The Reformed ministers strongly supported these laws, and they were often enforced rigorously. However, the actual application of these laws varied. In some places, like Basel and Massachusetts, the death penalty for adultery was rarely, if ever, carried out. In England, during the Puritan-controlled period from 1650 to 1660, only a few capital sentences for adultery were recorded. The gap between the letter of the law and its enforcement was common. For instance, in Scotland, the most common punishment for adultery was public humiliation, such as standing in the stool of repentance in front of the church on Sundays. Similarly, in other regions like Catholic Munster and Lutheran Nuremberg, capital punishment for adultery was sometimes carried out, but it was not the norm. Another area where Reformed territories stood out was in the enforcement of social and economic behavior. In the Grisons region of Switzerland, which was divided between Catholic and Reformed communities, Both sides enacted more laws against dancing, drunkenness, and sexual offenses after 1520. However, the Reformed communities passed more laws and enforced them more strictly than their Catholic neighbors. The impact of these strict laws and disciplinary systems on daily life is a complex topic. In Emden, a city in East Frisia, the Presbyterium, a church disciplinary body, dealt with increasing numbers of cases of sexual misconduct and drunkenness over the 17th century. Despite their efforts, drunkenness remained a significant problem, and the city's residents still saw it as a tribal vice. However, there was a noticeable change in attitudes toward violence. By the end of the 17th century, people who were brought before the Presbyterium for violent behavior often admitted that their actions violated principles of Christian gentleness, a concept that was rarely mentioned earlier. In Amsterdam, the Kerkeraad Church Council also saw an increase in cases of sexual misconduct and a decrease in violent behavior over the same period. This suggests that the Church's efforts may have had some impact on reducing violence and changing social norms. In Scotland, the decline of blood feuds and the reduction in illegitimate births from the 1660s to the 1720s indicate that the Reformed Church's influence may have contributed to more conservative sexual behavior and better impulse control. The Reformed Church's strict rules also affected family life. The consistorial systems, which were church bodies responsible for discipline, played a significant role in reinforcing the importance of the nuclear family and promoting a new standard of marital relations. For example, in Stirlingshire, Scotland, people began to confess to fornication more openly by the end of the 17th century, suggesting a growing awareness of the Church's ethical norms even among those who violated them. The Reformed Church's influence on art and culture is another area of interest. While many Reformed artists like Jacob Jordan's continued to produce works that were at odds with the Church's strict iconographic principles, the objects found in Reformed homes were noticeably different from those in Catholic homes. Reformed households in Metz, for example, avoided crucifixes and paintings of religious scenes that could be seen as idolatrous. This suggests that while artists might have been willing to take on lucrative commissions, most church members internalized the Reformed aversion to such imagery. Comparing the Reformed Church's disciplinary systems with those of Catholic and Lutheran churches, it appears that the Reformed had the most rigorous and continuous oversight. Reformed consistories and egerakte, marriage courts, existed in more regions and were more active in monitoring behavior than their counterparts in other confessions. They also played a role in resolving private disputes and intervening in family matters, which was less common in Catholic and Lutheran territories. Cross-confessional comparisons of behavior in religiously divided areas have yielded interesting results. For example, Huguenots, French Reformed, living in the same regions as Catholics during the 17th century had consistently lower rates of illegitimate births and prenuptial conceptions. This could be due to the Reformed Church's stricter moral standards or the pressure within minority communities to demonstrate exemplary behavior. However, in other areas like the princely courts of Germany or the spending habits of artisans and Amiens, there were few differences between Reformed and Catholic individuals. Overall, the Reformed Church's impact on society was significant, but its influence varied widely, depending on the region and the specific laws and practices in place. While the Reformed were known for their strict moral standards, the actual enforcement of these standards and their impact on daily life were complex and multifaceted. The Reformed churches, like those of Calvin and his followers, had big dreams. They wanted to change not just how people worshipped, but how they lived their everyday lives. They believed that by reforming the church, they could make the whole community better. They hoped for a world where everyone was chaste, sober, and kind to their neighbors. They wanted families to be strong, with clear roles for everyone, and they wanted people to keep their promises. In the early days, some leaders like John Calvin in Geneva, Andrew Melville in Scotland, and Gisbertus Voetius in the Netherlands tried to make these dreams a reality. They set up church courts, called consistories, to watch over people's behavior. These courts would call sinners to account, hoping to guide them back to a more virtuous path. For a while, in some places, these efforts seemed to work. In Scotland, for example, the new church courts started out cautiously, but grew more confident over time. However, in France, the Reformed churches faced a different challenge. They were a minority and feared losing members to the Catholic majority, so they became more lenient in their discipline. Despite these efforts, the changes were often limited. In many places, the church courts only dealt with the most obvious sins, or the most notorious sinners. Drinking and dancing, for example, remained popular despite the church's best efforts. In places like Emden and Bern, the church courts tried harder and longer to change people's behavior, but even there, they struggled against deeply rooted customs. Church leaders often wrote about their disappointment. Feeling that their efforts had little impact, however, the story isn't just about failure. The Reformed churches did make some changes. For example, they helped reduce feuding and violence between people. They also encouraged stronger family ties and more respectful marital relationships. Church members started to feel more responsible for each other's behavior, and many expressed sorrow for their sins, showing that the church's teachings had some effect. The Reformed churches also changed how people worshipped. They focused heavily on the Bible, reading it, preaching from it, and singing psalms. They wanted to make the Bible a central part of family life, encouraging people to read it and pray together at home. Some English Reformed leaders went even further, promoting a strict daily routine of prayer, meditation, and journaling to track one's spiritual growth. One of the most vivid descriptions of Reformed worship comes from a satire written in 1556. It describes a church in Geneva where the layout is simple, with benches for everyone and no special seating for the wealthy. The service starts with a prayer, led by the preacher, who stands with his head uncovered. The congregation kneels, and they sing psalms together. Communion is simple and practical, with bread and wine passed around, and the service is conducted in the local language. Baptisms are straightforward, with water poured on the child's face, and marriages are marked by a simple ceremony in the church, followed by a celebration at home. Funerals are also simple, with the body carried to the grave without much ceremony. These changes in worship and daily life show how the Reformed churches tried to create a new kind of community. They wanted people to live their faith every day, not just on Sundays. While they didn't achieve all their goals, they did leave a lasting impact on the people and communities they touched. The Reformed churches, which sprang up during the Reformation, brought about significant changes in how people worshipped and lived their daily lives. One of the most striking changes was in the way they structured their worship services and the calendar of religious observances. Before the Reformation, the church year was filled with a multitude of holy days, each dedicated to different saints, the Virgin Mary, and events in the life of Christ. These days were marked by feasts and fasts, creating a rhythm that shaped the lives of people from one year to the next. However, the Reformed churches largely did away with these special days, focusing instead on Sunday as the primary day of worship. Some Reformed churches, like those in Geneva and Scotland, abolished all holidays, while others, such as those in Zurich, Bern, and the Netherlands, retained a few key ones, like Christmas, Easter, Ascension, and Pentecost. This shift to a simpler calendar was not without its challenges. In England, for example, the church retained many pre-Reformation customs, including a large number of holy days. This led to a backlash from some who felt these practices were too closely tied to the old Catholic ways. John Can, a separatist, even went so far as to describe the sign of the cross during baptism as the mark of the beast. The tension over these practices was so intense that it sparked debates and conflicts, especially in England and the Netherlands, where some people strongly opposed the celebration of any holidays other than Sundays. Another significant change was the elimination of dietary restrictions, such as the prohibition on eating meat during Lent and on certain days of the week. This was a major shift from the Catholic tradition, where such rules were strictly followed. However, fasting remained an important part of Reformed worship, particularly during times of crisis or special occasions like communion. The heart of Reformed worship was the Sunday service, which centered around the sermon. The sermon was a lengthy and detailed exposition of a passage from the Bible. Ministers would often work their way through a book of the Bible, though special occasions could interrupt this sequence. The service typically included singing, but the focus was on the Word of God. Calvin, a key figure in the Reformed tradition, believed that the Psalms were the most appropriate form of worship, and in many Reformed churches, only psalms were sung. This practice spread widely, though some churches, particularly in Hungary, included other hymns as well. The layout of the church buildings also changed to reflect the new emphasis on the sermon. In many places, the old Catholic churches were stripped of their images, altars, and stained glass. Benches were arranged around the pulpit to ensure everyone could hear the minister clearly. New churches were designed to be more like lecture halls, with shapes that allowed for good acoustics and visibility. The interior decoration was minimal, often limited to painted boards with biblical passages, though some churches allowed funerary monuments for prominent members. Despite the Reformed ideal of equality, social hierarchies often crept back into the church. In many places, the best pews were reserved for the wealthy and powerful, leading to conflicts and complaints. The separation of men and women was also common, reflecting the societal norms of the time. Attendance at Sunday services was often mandated by law, especially in areas where the Reformed faith was the state religion. At first, this requirement met with resistance, and absenteeism was a significant problem. Over time, however, attendance improved, and in some places, like Scotland, it became a point of pride to have high rates of church attendance. In voluntary churches, where attendance was not legally required, the evidence is more mixed. Some individuals, like the schoolmaster David Beck in The Hague, were diligent in their attendance, while others, like Paul de Vendée, attended less frequently. In addition to the main Sunday service, many Reformed churches offered afternoon sermons or catechism classes, as well as midweek services. However, attendance at these additional services was often lower, and over time, they became less frequent. Communion practices varied among Reformed churches. In Zurich, communicants sat around the table, while in Bern, they stood. In Geneva, the service included a brief prayer and an admonition for self-examination before the distribution of the bread and wine. The Scottish and Dutch churches adopted a simpler form of communion, where people sat around a table. The Hungarian churches retained some elements of the Catholic tradition, such as kneeling for communion and the elevation of the host. Only those who could demonstrate a basic understanding of the faith, usually through the catechism, were admitted to communion. This meant that young people had to learn key texts like the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer before they could participate. The need for self-examination and preparation for communion was emphasized, though the intensity of this requirement varied among different Reformed churches. These changes in worship and daily life reflected the Reformed Church's commitment to a simpler, more Bible-focused form of Christianity. While the transition was not always smooth, it marked a significant break from the elaborate rituals and traditions of the late medieval church. Calvin and the Reformed churches faced many challenges when it came to changing long-standing religious practices. One of the most significant was the frequency of communion. In the late medieval period, people typically received communion only once a year. Calvin wanted to change this and suggested weekly communion, but this was too much of a change for many. The Genevan Council decided on quarterly communions instead. This became the norm in many Reformed churches across the continent, though some places like Basel and Nassau-Dillenburg celebrated communion monthly. In Hungary and certain Dutch cities, it was celebrated 6 times a year. In Scotland, however, communion was often even less frequent, sometimes only once or twice a year, and in some cases, it could be years between celebrations, if the minister felt the parish was unworthy. In England, the practice varied widely. Some cities and towns had monthly communion, while others only had it 3 or 4 times a year. Some parishes only held 1 or 2 communion services annually. In Wales, for example, a village called Trellick had 150 people attend communion on Easter, but only about 30 showed up for Christmas and Whitsun. When communion was celebrated, attendance was generally high in places like France, the Netherlands, and the Pays de Vaud. In the Scottish village of Montefieth, nearly everyone attended the annual communion. However, in some German villages, many people avoided communion altogether, and those who did participate often only did so once or twice a year. Women were more likely to attend communion than men, and the reasons for missing it ranged from feeling unworthy to simply forgetting the time. In Scotland, communion became a particularly emotional event, especially during times of religious tension. After the Perth Articles in 1618, many people traveled long distances to find a more pure form of communion. In the southwest of Scotland and in Ulster, these gatherings turned into 3-day events with powerful sermons and intense emotional experiences. Some people were so moved that they reportedly fainted, or even appeared to die. Despite official disapproval, these gatherings continued and became a regular part of Scottish worship. Critics argued that these events were more like pilgrimages where young men and women mixed and engaged in less spiritual activities. However, for many, these communion fairs were deeply moving and became a focus of their devotional life. Another significant change in Reformed practice was the approach to baptism. Before the Reformation, there was a strong belief that baptism was essential for salvation, and infants were often baptized within 48 hours of birth. Midwives were even authorized to baptize babies who were in danger of dying. Reformed churches, however, rejected this idea. They insisted that baptism should be a sign of incorporation into the church and a seal of Christ's promise of salvation. Most Reformed churches only performed baptisms during regular worship services, and some even refused to perform emergency baptisms, which sometimes led to conflicts with parents. In the early years of the Reformed churches, some parents were upset when ministers refused to baptize their dying infants. Over time, however, most people accepted the Reformed view, and the average time before infants were baptized increased. Some babies were even allowed to die without baptism, which was a significant change from pre-Reformation practices. Reformed churches also influenced naming practices. In Geneva, parents were encouraged to give their children Old Testament names, and this trend spread to other Reformed regions. In France, a high percentage of parents chose Old Testament names in the early years of the Reformed churches, but this trend declined over time. In England and the Netherlands, some church leaders also opposed non-biblical names. In New England, names that expressed gratitude or virtue, like Increase Mather, became popular. Reformed churches also changed the rules around weddings. They eliminated the prohibition on weddings during Lent and Advent, although the English Church maintained this prohibition until 1645. In southern France, Huguenots began to avoid marrying in May, just like their Catholic neighbors, who believed it would lead to barren families. In the Netherlands, May was considered a lucky time for weddings. In Scotland, where Lent was still observed, weddings were rare during this period until 1640. One of the most radical changes was the Reformed approach to funerals. Before the Reformation, funerals included prayers for the dead and a strong emphasis on the relationship between the living and the dead. Reformed churches rejected this, emphasizing that prayers for the dead were unnecessary and could lead to superstition. Instead, they focused on consoling the dying and those around them with the assurance of faith. Some Huguenot pastors offered remonstrances outside the home as the body was transported to the cemetery, but other practices like ringing church bells or having large funeral processions were discouraged. Despite these changes, some people still found it difficult to give up all forms of ceremony and commemoration. In some areas, like the Aspe Valley in Bern, there was a strong resistance to the Reformed changes, and people continued to commission masses for the dead. Overall, the Reformed churches made significant changes to religious practices, but the transition was not always smooth, and some traditions persisted in various forms. If sometimes the changes in church practices didn't happen as quickly as the church leaders wanted, and if different regions had different levels of change and acceptance, it's still clear that most of the big changes in church worship were eventually accepted by almost everyone without much trouble. Sure, many people in the English and German state churches still only took communion once a year. Some old pre-Reformation practices stuck around. New rituals, like funeral exhortations in France, filled some gaps in the new church services. Not many people showed up for midweek sermons. The cities had more early enthusiastic converts than the countryside, and voluntary churches had more than state-established ones. But over time, the initial resistance to new rituals faded away. What's especially striking is how little resistance there was to changes that directly affected key pre-Reformation practices. In the French, Dutch, and Swiss Reformed churches, almost everyone who was a full member started participating in the Lord's Supper every time it was celebrated. In Scotland, a unique, emotional style of communion services developed, which had a big impact on Protestant religious practices later on. If someone argues that the enthusiasm for these new practices declined over time, and that what we're seeing is just people conforming, it's worth noting that conformity shapes most people's religious lives. Even for those who just went along with the changes, being part of a Reformed church meant a big shift in how they experienced collective worship. The focus shifted from ornate rituals and elaborate ceremonies to simpler, more focused practices like psalm singing and preaching. The church calendar became more regular, with communion and occasional fast days becoming the main events. Church leaders believed that Sunday worship was just one part of a Christian's devotional life. They emphasized that the home should be a second place of worship, and the family a little church. They encouraged regular Bible reading and devotional practices at home. Samuel Ward wrote in 1621 that while sermons are like rain that waters the ground for a moment, books are like snow that stays longer on the earth. To participate fully in church life, one needed to know the basic prayers, the catechism, and be able to read. Admission to communion often required demonstrating knowledge of the catechism or certain prayers. Catechetical education became a key part of Reformed church life. Leo Judd's catechism in Zurich in 1534 was followed by many others, including those by Calvin and the Heidelberg Catechism, which became widely used. In many churches, Sunday afternoons were set aside for catechism classes. In France, there were special catechism sessions for children and adults before each communion service. The Synod of Dort in the Netherlands required catechism instruction at home, in school, and in church. In some places, knowing the catechism was necessary for receiving alms or getting married. In Hesse, people couldn't settle in a new place without showing they knew the basics of their faith. The emphasis on the catechism also led to the promotion of elementary education. In Poland, church leaders ordered the creation of schools for peasants. And in Scotland, the Parliament passed laws requiring schools in every parish. By the end of the 17th century, many Scottish parishes had schools, even though the laws weren't always followed immediately. In Hesse, the authorities visited schools to ensure they were teaching the Bible. In Reformed regions, the Bible was a central part of the curriculum, unlike in Lutheran areas where the focus was more on memorizing the catechism. Church leaders also encouraged private Bible reading. In Geneva, the consistory advised members to buy a Bible, and in Scotland, a law ordered certain people to acquire a Bible and a psalm book. Charitable groups helped distribute Bibles to the poor. In 1634, a London draper left money in his will to buy Bibles for poor families. Despite the cost, efforts were made to ensure that as many people as possible had access to the Bible. Along with promoting Bible ownership, Reformed churches encouraged family devotions. In Le Mans, the consistory advised heads of households to pray morning, evening, and before and after meals. In Nassau-Dillenburg, elders were supposed to visit homes to check on family devotions and Bible reading. Scottish churches distributed books of family exercises to help members with their devotions. While these efforts weren't always consistent, they were widespread. Studies show that the implementation of these measures varied. In Heidelberg, a citywide examination found that only a third of the population could recite basic points of the faith. In Oppenheim, a small town, only 34% of young people presenting themselves for communion knew the entire catechism well, while 12% couldn't answer any questions about it. Even so, all were admitted to communion. By the end of the 17th century, more people had a good grasp of the catechism. But mastery was still not universal. Despite some resistance, literacy and the ability to read religious texts increased over time. In rural Zurich, the number of people who could read and write grew between the 17th and 18th centuries. In Scotland, the ability to sign one's name, a sign of literacy, increased from about a quarter of the adult male population in the mid-17th century to 65% by the mid-18th century. Similar trends were seen in other Reformed areas. While the ability to write was more influenced by economic factors, the ability to read was strongly linked to the Reformed emphasis on direct access to the Bible. By the late 17th century, most Reformed believers could either read the Bible themselves or have it read to them by someone in their family. While the Reformed emphasis on education and literacy was not necessarily greater than in Lutheran areas, it had a significant impact on the religious practices of the time. By the last quarter of the 17th century, books had become a common sight in rural households, especially in Reformed communities. In the Zurich countryside, for example, about two-thirds of rural homes had at least one book, often a Bible, a Psalter, a prayer book, or a popular devotional classic like Johann Arndt's True Christianity or Bailey's Practice of Piety. By the middle of the 18th century, almost every rural household had at least one book. A pastor from Wiesendangen noted that during his visits, he found only 2 houses without any books. The inhabitants of these houses explained that they knew their prayers by heart and didn't need the Psalter. The pastor also mentioned that people often asked him for help understanding passages from the Bible or Psalter, showing that these books were not just decorations, but were actively read and discussed. This trend wasn't unique to Switzerland. In the Netherlands, court and notarial records from the 17th century show that books were widely owned and read. There are stories of servants taking breaks to read the New Testament, guildsmen reading Bible chapters over breakfast, and wives reading scripture to their husbands to encourage better behavior. In England, diaries and spiritual autobiographies reveal that even people of modest means carefully read and shared books. Thomas Chubb, a chandler's assistant, was part of a group of journeymen who met regularly to debate theological issues, using notes they had written on relevant scriptural passages. Richard Baxter, a famous Puritan minister, wrote about his upbringing in a pious household where the Bible was read regularly. A poor day laborer even lent the family his old copy of Edmund Bunny's Book of Christian Exercise. In the upland regions of the Pays de Vaud in Switzerland, it was common to see prayers and pious verses engraved on the facades of chalets. One schoolmaster in Poitou remembered his pious wife, who loved studying the Bible and reading works that helped her prepare for death. She knew the Psalms so well that she would sometimes sing them in her sleep. Despite the strong emphasis on catechesis and family Bible reading, many rural church members still had a shaky knowledge of the catechism by the end of the 17th century. However, literacy skills, especially reading, had become widespread in most Reformed communities. Many people owned a Bible or other devotional book. While it's hard to know if every family used these books for regular devotions, it's clear that the Reformed Reformation promoted a new relationship with the printed word, characterized by the intensive reading and rereading of the Bible and devotional classics. In contrast, the English practical divines of the generation of Greenham, Rogers, and Perkins developed a more rigorous style of piety. They encouraged believers to keep journals and prepare testimonies of their spiritual growth. This led to a wealth of documentation about the personal spiritual experiences of those shaped by this style of piety. For example, Nehemiah Wallington, a pious Londoner, produced over 50 volumes of private notebooks between 1618 and 1658, detailing his spiritual journey. Most of the godly grew up in pious families and were churchgoers. Their spiritual awakenings often came from reading a book or hearing a sermon that made them realize they needed clear evidence of saving faith. This led to deep worry and doubt, as many felt they couldn't find the marks of election listed in devotional treatises. Wallington, for instance, was so convinced that God had forsaken him that he attempted suicide several times. Many others experienced similar despair. With time and dedication, most ardent believers eventually found some measure of assurance. They often had moments of rapture, like Wallington did in 1643, when he felt God's presence in a profound way. These moments could be followed by periods of doubt, but the desire to reinforce their faith led them to engage in intense spiritual practices. Wallington, for example, would wake up between 2 and 5 a.m. to pray before starting work at 6 a.m. He attended up to 19 sermons in a single week and took peppercorns or cloves to stay awake during long sermons. Lady Margaret Hoby preferred attending sermons on an empty stomach to stay more attentive. Communion and fast days were special moments for the godly, times when they renewed their covenant with God after prayer and preparation. Wallington created a set of articles to live by, which he reviewed weekly and fined himself for breaking. This intense and regular practice of piety was like an arduous pilgrimage toward the heavenly city, where pious believers spiraled between doubt and reassurance, growing closer to God through prayer and communion. The practical divines called believers to a narrow path, setting them apart from the customs of the world. This created a divide in communities between those who attended sermons and those who enjoyed dances and sports. While it's hard to know the exact ratio, one estimate suggested that only 1 in 20 Englishmen was truly Christian in the early 17th century. In New England, however, a different picture emerged. An Essex vicar who emigrated to Massachusetts wrote that in the new colony, the better part of the community was also the greater part. Historians have suggested that the godly often came from wealthier families who saw Puritan piety as a way to justify their prosperity and control the poorer part of the community. However, detailed local studies have generally not supported this. One study in Sussex found no significant wealth differences between families with pious names and those with more conventional names. The main difference was that the godly often asked for their daughters' marriage portions to be invested at meet rates of interest, while their less zealous neighbors wanted the most profit. Despite their intense and regular practice of piety, the godly were not always successful in accumulating wealth. Wallington, for example, filled many volumes with accounts of God's mercies and his prayers, but he didn't keep business records, and his livelihood was always precarious. This shows that the godly were deeply committed to their spiritual lives, even if it didn't always translate into material success. The story of Reformed devotion is a tale of varied reception and adaptation. It's a story that shows how the same ideas and practices can take on different shapes and meanings when they travel from one place to another. The piety of the English godly, with its intense focus on personal salvation and moral improvement, is well documented and often seen as the standard for Reformed devotion, but this is only part of the picture. In Scotland, the ideas of English practical divinity found a quick and eager audience. Scottish writers like William Cowper echoed the language of their English counterparts, speaking of the golden chain of salvation and the importance of finding signs of God's calling. Scottish diaries, like those of Archibald Johnston, show a deep engagement with these ideas, with people keeping detailed records of their sins, prayers, and experiences. The practice of making personal covenants which fit well with Scottish traditions of bonding and commitment became widespread. Despite these influences, Scottish piety developed its own distinct features, such as a strong emphasis on covenanting and communal gatherings for worship. On the continent, the reception was more mixed. In the Netherlands, the works of English divines, like Richard Baxter and John Bunyan, became extremely popular. Dutch ministers like Teelink and Voetius were deeply influenced by these writings and helped translate and spread them. The Dutch Reformed Church saw a shift in focus over the century, moving from calls for stricter government enforcement of moral laws to a more individualized approach to piety. This led to the formation of conventicles, small groups of believers who met to discuss sermons and support each other in their spiritual journeys. Writers like Wilhelmus A. Brekel and Herman Witsius emphasized the need for believers to be sure of their election and provided guidance on how to recognize the signs of God's grace. In France, however, the reception was much cooler. French Reformed leaders like Moïse Amiraut criticized the mechanical approach to piety found in English works, preferring a more intellectual and less experiential understanding of faith. Huguenot diaries and memoirs show a focus on regular participation in church services and a less intense regimen of private devotions. The French Reformed were more concerned with defending their faith against Catholic attacks than with the inward experiences of individual believers. In the German-speaking regions, the reception was somewhere in between. English devotional literature gained popularity, especially in areas close to the Dutch border. Cities like Basel and Oppenheim became centers for translating and publishing these works, which often crossed confessional lines and were read by both Reformed and Lutheran believers. The rise of German Pietism in the late 17th century was partly influenced by these English and Dutch devotional practices. By the end of the 17th century, Reformed piety had taken on many different forms. The intense, methodical approach of English practical divinity was just one style among many. This diversity shows that the way people practiced their faith was shaped not only by their beliefs, but also by their cultural context and the specific challenges they faced. The story of Reformed devotion is a reminder that religious practices are always evolving and adapting to the world around them.